So, hi everyone. My name is Christine Hong. I am the co-director, along with Neda Tanasowski, of a new Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. I'm also the director of the program in Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. I'm going to do an introduction of this event. This is a Zoom teach-in on anti-Asian xenophobia in an age of COVID-19. But I'd like to turn things over to Meredith to speak about some housekeeping rules.
Thank you, Christine. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this very current and poignant event. I just want to do a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. Please make sure all of your lines are muted to reduce any background noise. We do also have a participant joining us via phone today, so I'd like you to identify yourself. The area code for the phone number is 408, and the last four digits of the phone number are 648. Please identify yourself and let me know who you are. You can send me a chat, or you can just call out and let me know who's on the line with us.
Okay. And I believe there are other people who are in the waiting room right now.
Yes,
okay.
They come.
Great. So I wanted to, so this particular event, as Meredith was saying, is something that was born out of conversations, difficult conversations that have to do with our current moment. And what I wanted to do is, first of all, I want to thank all the co-sponsors for this event. In addition to the Center for Racial Justice, the SUA Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Asian American Pacific Islander Resource Center, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion all supported this event. Thank you so much to our speakers, who I will introduce in just a moment, and to all of you for taking part in this event. Thank you to Meredith, thank you to Kaz, thank you to Jorge, all for your support. So I wanted to say a few things. This campus too has experienced an intensification of anti-Asian racism, and it was partly in response to that conversations were happening. And out of that, and in addition to speaking to our two guest speakers, the questions that we were thinking about were, how do we understand anti-Asian xenophobia, not just as a reflection of the current pandemic or even the Trump moment, but how do we understand this through a longer historical view? And how do we understand too, and this is something that many people have raised in recent media reports, how do we understand the ways in which race and disease get conflated? You know, we have heard Donald Trump and others use the term the Chinese virus. And so some of the questions that are motivating this teach-in is a desire to ask the question, how do we navigate the perils of this moment in which anti-Asian rhetoric could and does slide into anti-Asian brutality? So there's a kind of, how do we understand that kind of suspension that we get placed in between hate speech and acts of violence, and when does harm get registered? In other words, does it take hate speech turning into an act of violence in order for harm to get registered? And the other thing that we want to do, so our speakers today won't speak for particularly long, but we have a lot of time for Q&A. And one of the things I hope that we could start doing together is to think about community processes around racial harm. How could we think forward together in a spirit of organizing collectively? So it's really with enormous pleasure that I introduce our two guest speakers who will lead this teach-in and who have taken their time out of extraordinarily busy schedules. You may have seen Russell Zhang and Cynthia Chue on the national scale, on radio programs, and in speaking with them and inviting them to take part in this UC Santa Cruz teach-in, they said to me that they privilege ethnic studies spaces and spaces of education. And so they've taken time out of their very busy schedules to join us, and we're so grateful for that. Professor Russell Zhang he is a professor of Asian American Studies at SF State. For those of you who are CRES majors and others, you know that this was the site that inaugurated the Third World Liberation Front movement that gave rise to ethnic studies as a national project. Professor Zhang is a scholar of race and religion. He's written a book, At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among Ancestors and Family Sacrifices, the Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, and along with Chinese for Affirmative Action, which is a long-standing, deep-rooted organization in the Bay Area, as well as the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. He helped to establish something that has had so much currency in our moment, unfortunately, which is the Stop AAPI Hate Center. Cynthia Chue is the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. This is, as I said, a community-based civil rights organization based in San Francisco. I've had the pleasure of working with her executive director, Vin Pan, on other struggles, and can just say that when there have been struggles, both having to do with the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and beyond, Chinese for Affirmative Action has always been there in solidarity. CAA was one of the partners that established that reporting site, Stop AAPI Hate. And this online reporting center is dedicated to documenting hate incidents and developing community-based solutions. She has very broad organizing roots in local, state, and national community-based organizations. She's worked on a range of issues from reproductive justice, gender-based violence, immigrant and refugee issues, as well as environmental justice issues, both in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. So I really welcome them and thank them for joining us. And so please also, I know that you're all muted, but please join me in welcoming them to this teach-in. So I'm going to yield the floor to them, and I ask that during their presentations, if you wouldn't mind writing your comments and your questions in chat, we will get to them during the Q&A afterwards. So if you wouldn't mind doing that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christine, and thank you to all the co-sponsors. At a time where there is so much to be concerned about, the pandemic, this is a time of also tremendous pain for our communities, and appreciate this time to talk about anti-Asian racism and xenophobia and putting this into context, because our understanding this issue historically and what is happening today is going to be very critical as we think about how we respond. And I do want to pay a special note that this is also happening while Black men are being killed. We are in solidarity with the communities in Minneapolis and the struggles that are happening there. And so it's really important for me to start off our conversation mentioning that. So as Christine had mentioned, Russell and I, representing our institutions as well as Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council based in Los Angeles, established Stop API Hate because we knew that because of the way that the coronavirus was being framed and covered, that Asian Americans would experience a backlash. And we have today some data that we'd like to share and some of our findings. But I think it's really important to understand that when we established this reporting center, we had no idea if individuals would trust us and describe really harrowing, dehumanizing experiences. And they did. And so we want to kind of use this time, the moment, to lift up these stories, firsthand accounts that people are experiencing. And so let's move to the individual accounts, and we have some readers for us.
Apologies. So the first one, I am posting this on behalf of my dad, a 71-year-old Korean adoptee. Yesterday, he was chased out of a rural convenience store after asking to use the restroom.
The next description?
Sorry, I was muted. I was sitting on the New Jersey Transit in an inside seat near the window. A man looked at me, went out of his way to lean inside, and coughed on me. He made eye contact with me and walked away.
My niece was at a store today, and this lady spat on an Asian family after insulting them because coronavirus was their fault. It's unbelievable where we are.
We were having community circle in our grade 4 classroom. One of the students said, quote, "Kill the Chinese," end quote, in Spanish when it was his turn to speak. Many of the Spanish-speaking children laughed.
This is very, very bizarre, but ex-husband threatened me that if I do not sign an agreement to follow a corona guideline, he will not return my child to me, even though I have sole custody. Also, he screamed in front of my child, saying, "I do not want to be around you. You are bringing corona to me and this community." I was stunned.
The person said online, "USA should blow out the China." He also commented, "I feel like Trump should use nuclear to finish China."
A white male customer in the drive-thru asked my ethnicity and assumed I had a coronavirus. I asked if there was a problem, and he replied defensively, "The virus came from China." As I got his drink from my partner, he shouted, "Don't touch the top." After I gave his credit card back, he wiped his hands and card in disgust as if he had a disease.
Overheard in a public restroom, "Thank God no Chinese children were at a soccer practice to infect others."
Can go to the next slide, please. Great. So one of the things we wanted to do is try to describe what is happening, and that was really the intent of Stop API Hate. Was we wanted to be able to document and understand the extent and magnitude in which hate was occurring so that we could develop appropriate responses. So as you can see, we have close to 1,900 incident reports that are coming from all over the country. And roughly about 40% are coming from California, and we have roughly about 16% in the Bay Area alone, just to give you a sense. I also wanted to take note that a lot of us get asked, is this a rise? How does this compare to prior years pre-COVID? And so just to give you an example, other tracking centers were formed in 2016, and they roughly received about 100 incidents per year. And so in the 8 weeks or so, receiving 1,800 is obviously a huge jump. And of course, again, we maintain that this is underreported, and also that this is a tip of the iceberg. So one of the things we want to do is we want to be very careful about not calling this hate crimes, because as you can see, we have a number of incidents that don't rise to that narrow definition of a hate crime. Majority of the incidents are verbal harassments, but I don't want to minimize it, because as you can see from the descriptions, while some of them may not rise to the level of a hate crime or there's no legal course of action, you can see that they're harrowing, they're traumatizing, and have left many folks who've been targeted, feeling stunned and have been, traumatized, I think, by these incidents. You can also see that shunning is a big component of that. Physical assaults make up the third largest. And of course, the coughing and spitting is particularly alarming because we're undergoing a public health crisis. And this is something that suggests that they're not only blaming Chinese and Asian Americans for bringing the virus, but they want to somehow reinfect or infect others. So there's like this strange thing about coughing and spitting that I know is really perplexing to all of us. We also saw workplace discrimination and other civil rights violations, like being barred from public or private establishments and public transportation. And so this is all, of course, happening while we're sheltering in place. So as less people were on public transportation and commuting and showing up physically to work. Next slide, please. So these are self-reported, and so we asked respondents to say, well, what do you think the reasons for discrimination? So clearly because of their race and ethnicity. One of the things that we've noted is that while Chinese are the intended target, all API groups are being affected by this. And earlier on, before face masks were being required as they are today, face masks were the object of scorn. People were actually targeted for wearing the face mask. And there were perceptions that those who were Asians who were wearing face masks were actually infected. And so that obviously has changed now because it's a requirement. You can see other areas where, gender played a role, language, and initially food, especially given the ways that this issue was framed as being the result of wet markets and racist tropes about diet and cuisine and hygiene and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, because we've been sheltered in place, you could see a majority of these incidents were happening while people are grocery shopping, picking up medications at pharmacies and big box retail, and also limited where people are, trying to just get the limited amount of exercise that we can in our neighborhoods and parks. Initially, though, before shelter-in-place orders took effect, we saw incidents coming from schools as well as on public transit and in workplaces. Next slide. I think this is you, Russell.
Thanks, Cynthia. So it's sort of interesting, we just have a virus coming. People are worried about a virus, but then it becomes used to target Asians, and we see the spate of anti-Asian racism. And so the question is, why anti-Asian racism now? How is it connected to a biological virus? And that's what Professor Hong raises, like, why is a natural disease become racialized? How does it take on racial characteristics? And so we're going to argue that three main factors have led to the racialization of the disease and the racial profiling of Asian Americans. It's the political rhetoric, it's media representations, and the historic stereotypes of Asians. So I'll quickly go through each point. What we found in our data, and especially through our news content analysis, is that people were beginning to harass Asians when COVID-19 arrived to the US. We knew that would happen. but it really spiked after officials and elected leaders insisted on using the term Chinese virus and began to blame China for being the source of the disease. By insisting on using that term, Chinese virus, instead of its scientific term, it made the connection, it made an association that the virus is Chinese and that Chinese people have that virus. So again and again, politicians were using that type of inflammatory rhetoric, probably to deflect blame from their mismanagement of the disease. It's to rile up their base, and it's again to scapegoat others. And so that's been part of the strategy of politicians. And now both parties are using US-China relations as a major campaign theme, and they're beginning to China bash. So that political rhetoric, that inflammatory China bashing leads to the bashing of Chinese people, and then the bashing of Chinese people in the US and people who look like Chinese. Associated with the political rhetoric is how the media framed the issue. Initially, they used the term China virus as well. And of course, they have to report on when Trump and others use the term. And so they circulate the framing of the virus as being Chinese. And initially, and still today, they depict the disease with Chinese people wearing masks. And so you can see in this Wall Street Journal op-ed, China's the real sick man of Asia, depicting that, signifying the disease as a Chinese woman wearing a mask. And so these representations were circulated, and again, that cements in people's minds the nexus between the disease and China. And today, that's sort of new to the scene, especially after 9/11. We have parallels a lot to 9/11 in terms of anti-Muslim attacks and anti-Asian attacks today. But today we have social media that circulates even more offensive posts and racist memes that, again, hardwire and chemically seal in people's minds the connection of the disease with Chinese people. One example that went viral early was the post of the Chinese person eating a bat, right? And so that, again, it's the eating habits of Chinese, their dietary habits were seen as exotic and the source of the disease. This Instagram post is a coronavirus party coming from the University of Albany. So students there had a party with Corona beer, but to celebrate, they had pictures of Chinese people wearing masks, again, associating Chinese people with the disease and the disease being Chinese. Also scattered around the party were hazmat suits and, sadly, pictures of Chinese people with masks, but with their eyes X'd out as if they had passed away from the disease. The political rhetoric and the media framing reinforce and resurrect this notion of the yellow peril. This is a racialized stereotype that's been around since the 18th and 19th century. And it's a stereotype that Asians are a threat to the West, that those from the East with their nameless, faceless hordes will come and take over, conquer the West, especially with their diseases. So if you could see the picture on the right, in the 19th century, the epidemics of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy came to the United States, and you can see the specters of these diseases emanating from San Francisco Chinatown. That led, or that became a justification to spur interpersonal violence against Chinese. And so you see on the picture on the left, the cartoon about the Chinese must go. So disease and the fear of what Chinese taking away white jobs led to racist legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as the purging of counties of Chinese settlements. So in Santa Cruz County during that time, Monterey and Santa Cruz Chinatowns were actually removed. My own family had moved to Monterey and they got displaced in 1906. Disease and health policy were again used in 1900 to control and to discriminate against Chinese. When the bubonic plague came, health officials actually quarantined all of San Francisco Chinatown, roped it off, used barbed wire, and kept Chinese in segregated to get infected while allowing white people to get out. In Santa Ana Chinatown in California and in Honolulu Chinatown, they actually burned down the entire Chinatowns because they wanted to get rid of the infected buildings. That sort of stupidly just spread out the rats that had the disease, but it left thousands homeless. So you can see in the Chronicle picture that the bubonic plague epidemic has eerie parallels to today. You have a white working class that's afraid of its economic standing. You have a disease that comes from Asia. And so you have the scapegoating of Chinese as being disease carriers as the yellow peril. And you have interpersonal violence and racist policies enacted against them. And we have the exact same thing today. Trump initiated the mass immigration ban. And just this week, 2 Republican congresspeople introduced legislation to exclude Chinese students. It's the second Chinese Exclusion Act, all under the guise of trying to protect national security and to stop the coronavirus. So you can see how a disease, a natural virus, gets racialized and takes on cultural meanings, get connected to racial bodies like Chinese people's bodies. You have a general truth that the virus comes from China, and then politicians, using their rhetoric, using their platform, make it the Chinese virus. So again, the virus is Chinese, and Chinese people have the virus. It's reinforced through media, especially with depictions of people in their face masks. So eventually, people associate Chinese people in masks as being diseased, infected, the yellow peril. That leads to the racial profiling of Chinese and people who look Chinese. And this is how I think it's operating now in the US. Everybody has a schema. This is the way our brain is hardwired to process information, to process perceptions. So for example, if you see a dog growling at you, you don't stop to think, there's a dog, its teeth are bared, it's growling, and then you deliberate and then think, oh, that's a threat, and you run away. You automatically process all that information and perceive the threat and run away. That's how your schema helps you adapt to your environment. People have schema about other people as well to perceive threats or dangers. And so in the United States, we're raised to notice 3 things about others. We notice, first of all, their age, then their gender, and also their racial background. That's just the way we're socialized to perceive the world. And so people categorize people as Asians, and with your schema, you're primed to notice things like a face mask. Given that schema, then you make automatic assumptions about the people. You automatically process that information. So you may see an Asian with a mask and you attribute their mask wearing to their racial uniform. Oh, that means they're diseased. When you make that automatic assumption, you have a quick behavioral response to a threat. You go into flight or fight mode. And so the flight mode is, if you see an Asian wearing a mask, is that you would maybe subconsciously move away from them. You would shun them. You may imperceptibly stop and shy away. The fight mode is you would attack them. So we're not saying everybody's being intentionally racist in this moment of pandemic, but that people are racially profiling Asians, that we all have implicit biases, and that we're operating out of these implicit biases that have been constructed by political rhetoric and media framing and historic stereotypes. Even I, as an Asian American studies scholar, I have this implicit bias too, because I've been shaped by media and politics. So if I see an Asian person wearing a mask, I'm more likely to think that person may be infected. Whereas if I saw a non-Asian wearing a mask, I would think, oh, they're probably just protecting themselves or they're following the law. This is how implicit bias works. It's a subconscious reaction to threats. So what's happened since then is, now that people are racially profiling Asians, it's had a major impact on our community. And I'll quickly spell some out. And Cynthia, she wants you could talk about some as well. Initially, when the coronavirus came, people began to boycott Chinese restaurants and Asian businesses. So Asian businesses have been economically more hard hit than other communities, and we have more layoffs in our community, and we have more economic downturns in our ethnic enclaves. Again, 50 to 70% of the business was already below normal even before shelter in place. As we talked about in our incidents, we've seen hundreds of cases of assaults, people getting pushed and shoved on transit. We talked about, actually, the most egregious case is a Sam's Club incident in Texas, where a family, not even Chinese, they're refugees from Burma, were slashed in the head by an assailant who said, "It's because of you the coronavirus happens." This was a 2-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a father. So that's now being investigated as a hate crime. In Australia, a man died from a heart attack because even while he was calling out for help, bystanders refused to help him because they thought he had the coronavirus. So people are clearly dying not only from the pandemic, but also dying from the racism. And finally, Asian Americans on the individual level have high rates of anxiety and fear and stress at this moment. You know how self-concept is developed? It's based on how others perceive you. You understand your own self by how others react and treat you. So if your mom loves you, then you feel like a loved child. If your UC Santa Cruz professor gives you an A, you think you're smart. If other people perceive you as diseased or infected, then you see yourself, maybe I am diseased or infected. You may self-stigmatize yourself the way others stigmatize yourself. That's how we develop negative self-concepts. And I'm afraid that's what's happening to a lot of Asians. As they see others shunning them, they may want to shun their Asianness. And especially for youth, that's especially who are sensitive to others' perceptions, this self-stigmatization is really harmful. Beyond having a negative self-esteem, that leads to higher rates of depression and anxiety, and it has health consequences later on. So you can see from this chart, 75 to 90% of Asian Americans now worry about racial bias. We're hypersensitive, we're really aware of how others are perceiving us. When we go out into public, we suppress coughs. We make the risk calculation, should I wear a mask or not? Because if I wear a mask, I may be attacked. If I don't wear a mask, I may get coronavirus. And so, like other groups, we don't feel safe going out in public simply because of our race. So to wrap up quickly, we're going to talk about what Asian Americans are doing now to protect ourselves. I'll talk about the political statements and some of the counter media, and then maybe Cynthia could talk about some of the community resistance efforts. You know, I started off that history is repeating itself. We knew from past history that if an epidemic comes, Asians would get scapegoated and attacked. We knew that they would be attacked and have policies enacted against them. But the other part of history that's being repeated is that Asian Americans have always resisted the discrimination they faced. They've always combated that racism. So during the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were thousands of appeals to the courts about the Exclusion Act. There was a mass boycott of American goods, and Chinese Americans engaged in the largest case of mass civil disobedience. Over 100,000 Chinese refused to register with the government like they were supposed to. I talked about my family in Santa Cruz County being driven out. We actually, it was a fishing village, and these fishing people filed a class action lawsuit against the largest corporate landowner in California at the time. They filed a lawsuit against Stanford University and its Pacific Improvement Company. So Asians have always resisted, and we're resisting today. Our elected officials are trying to flip the political rhetoric. Rather than hate mongering, they're calling for the end of hate speech, the end of China bashing, and to call for more civil discourse of dignity and respect for everybody. We're calling on our federal agencies, and in California, Stop API Hate is calling on Governor Newsom to create a statewide task force to take proactive actions to stop this hate. We talked about how media represents Asians as diseased and the disease as Asian, but there's a lot of Asian Americans who are initiating counter narratives. There are hashtag movements like Wash the Hate, and our leaders, our celebrities, our athletes are all standing up to speak out against the hate. Jeremy Lin, in fact, put up $1 million of his own money to stop the racism. Cynthia, you could talk about the community resistance.
Yeah, great. It looks like my connection is unstable. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay. So as Russell outlined, resistance and rising up is in our DNA. And that's always been the case. It's been the way that we've survived, by coming together. And this is no exception. I think early on, when the Chinatowns were starting to experience boycotts and things of that nature, community groups had come together. This photo is actually taken in San Francisco, where there was a rally to essentially say, fight the virus, not the people. So this is something that I think we should really uphold, because it's certainly something that I didn't grow up understanding, that we've always fought back by whatever means was available to us. And the difference, I think, if we go to the next slide, because we understood our history and we knew what was going to happen, we quickly came together to form Stop API Hate. We knew that the way that the media was covering it, the way the elected officials were starting to scapegoat, that we would see a rise in anti-Asian racism. And unfortunately, this became true in terms of what we started to receive through API Hate. So some of the things that we wanted to do is obviously document this because it was important for individuals experiencing hate to be a part of a collective voice saying, this is not only happening to me, but it's happening to others. And one of the things that we want to do beyond just documenting it is to be able to, again, develop appropriate responses. We are seeing the need to develop resources that are in language, that address a range from know your rights information to mental health resources. We are also actively working with different government agencies, everything from human rights commissions to working with school board members on interventions that respond to what's happening now, but also preparing for the future as economies start to open up. And as was mentioned before, we are hoping that, and advocating, not just hoping, that our elected officials, including our governor here in California, takes this seriously, and just in the way that he has created economic task force and public health emergency task force, we need a task force to address bias that we see resulting from COVID-19. Next slide.
So in conclusion,
so obviously, oh, go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, so in conclusion, we'd like to look forward, outward, and inward. And I'll take, actually, you could talk about what we expect to happen and how we want to work in solidarity. So looking forward about the danger of hate. Cynthia, you could talk about our fears of upcoming hate.
Sure. So as we said before, we do believe that this is an undercount of what's really happening. We also believe that this is the tip of the iceberg, and we are working in our local communities in California, but also nationwide with other community-based organizations, including community leaders from the AMEMSA community, and hearing lessons learned from post 9/11. It is extremely important that we look at this as a movement moment in terms of what we can do to bring our community together, as well as work across communities. And so one of the things that I know that we're concerned about is the surge, potential mass violence, that this will continue to escalate both online, offline. And so it's going to be really important that we do scenario planning and that we make sure that resources, again, are available in language, that we really prepare educators and parents when schools start to resume, as well as private businesses and what they can do, as well as workplaces. What can we do to enforce the civil rights protections, as well as condemn any efforts to scapegoat and place blame on Asian Americans? We're going to need a combination of efforts that really raise awareness to change hearts and minds, but we also need enforcements of civil rights statutes. And most importantly, I think this is an opportunity for us as a community to come together to look at the ways that we can strengthen our community, address community safety and justice, in ways that challenge our notions that state institutions or that we rely on government or elected officials to save us, but rather how do we work together as a community and across communities to address this issue.
So yeah, so we expect a surge in hate, and we've already seen and witnessed the hate, and we see it, how COVID-19 has exposed the structural racism in the United States. That Asian Americans aren't just scapegoated, but African Americans, Pacific Islanders, the Navajo Nation are all dying at rates far higher than the national norm. We could see clearly how the Hispanic Latinx community has been more economically hard hit. And so just as this is a moment where we need, as an Asian American community, to be more vigilant, this is a moment for us to work in solidarity with other communities of color. So we mourn and grieve over the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Audrey Arbery. We want to stand up against systematic racism in all its forms. And you know, what we're saying is that Asian Americans are being racially profiled now. They're seen as threats, they're seen as dangerous. And so we could understand, or we should understand, why other groups are being mass detained, mass incarcerated, mass banned. Because again, Asian Americans themselves now are facing mass bans and now a mass exclusion legislation. So to conclude, both Cynthia and I, we believe that there's hope in organizing our communities. That's only through social movements can we actually affect change. And that's how Asian Americans have historically affected change, despite epidemics, despite recessions, despite racist politicians. They were able to resist because they organized and they mobilized and they won, maybe not immediately, but over time. And so that's what we're hoping to do now with Stop API Hate, in collaboration with other national groups, both Asian American ones and our allies. We're working to organize our communities, and we really appreciate how Santa Cruz has organized. As you guys have experienced online issues and are creating the new ethnic studies program, we hope to again work in solidarity with you in this fight as well. So thank you, and we are open to questions, and actually really interested to learn from you and the students of how you hope to organize and how you hope to work through this issue.
So I want to invite people to contribute comments or questions, preferably relatively brief, either through the chat function or by raising your hand. And if you see, let me see. Yeah, I'm trying to figure, is there a way, Meredith, that people can raise their hands? I'm not seeing that
Yeah,
function.
they can.
Okay, they can.
Yep.
Okay, so they have that capacity.
Mhm.
So feel free to do so. But I was hoping, since there are so many students who have joined us today, if you, Russell, and you, Cynthia,
I love it.
naked child in the back.
This is our lives right now, Christine. So
Preserved for posterity. If you could speak about your own journey doing the kind of politically engaged work that you do, community-based work that you do, if you could each speak to that question just as an opening, a way of opening up the broader discussion.
yeah, Russell, do you want to go first? Did we lose Russell?
I don't know what happened to Russell.
Oh,
It looks like we may have lost him.
Oh
Uh-oh.
my goodness. Okay, well,
I guess
Russell,
I'll go
we'll come back.
first.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. You're talking about the journey overall, or
Yeah,
through Stop
overall.
API hate? Oh, okay.
Yes, I think that the students especially would be so interested in hearing about that.
Yeah. Well, for one, I want to just claim that I am an ethnic studies major and women's studies major. So, woohoo. And I certainly did not set out. I mean, I think I was the kind of person that wanted to understand why things were the way they were, right? I sort of instinctively knew that there were pre-existing conditions, that these were not accidental. And so that really fed my curiosity. And I think when I think about the work that I've been so privileged to be able to do, the heart of it has always been about structural inequality, whether it was women having full access to healthcare and reproductive health services, to immigrant families being able to live in safe conditions, and language access, immigrant rights. And if I look back, there's always been my involvement has involved violence within our community and the different manifestations. And so actually, I discovered something really incredible doing the Stop API hate work that just kind of blew my mind. One is that I have always tried to understand the manifestation of how white young men have been radicalized in our country. Because we think about, a lot of people talk about Vincent Chin, but there have been so many other cases that have involved heinous crimes. So I don't know if people remember in the late 80s, Patrick Purdy, who shot into an elementary school in Stockton, California. This was somebody who had a very difficult life, was virtually abandoned, and was engaged in drugs, and also went to the military. And he essentially shot into this schoolyard 5 children from Cambodia, Cambodian refugees, and injured 32 other children and teachers on the playground. And initially, it was not described as a hate crime, but they found literature, anti-Asian literature, and essentially he had blamed Asians for taking away jobs from real Americans. And so the striking thing about this story is that I also had the opportunity to work with somebody who was formerly incarcerated, who spent 17 years in prison. And he is a survivor of that violence. And he watched his cousin die on that playground. And so in my mind, I think about that cycle of violence. How did that affect PJ and his journey, how he ended up in prison and causing harm to somebody, and is now a leader in restorative justice and healing. And so when I think about the ways in which young people are radicalized or given opportunities to understand their history and their healing and where they are today, it's mind-boggling, because I think about the cycle of violence of hurt people hurt other people, right? Hurt people hurt people. And so we have this moment for me is really about how do we break the cycle? How do we understand these root causes? And I think it's something that's been a through line. And we have to recognize the relationship between interpersonal violence and state-sanctioned violence. So when I think about how our immigration system, how our criminal justice system, how all of these institutions are, a lot of people say they're broken. They're actually working exactly the way that they're set up to work. So it's been incredible to be able to make those connections and linkages. And we're actually working on a program to highlight this, because there are so many, including the 2017 murder of a South Asian man in Kansas, and what happened ensuing that. So it's sad to me that we have to document incidents of hate that have been targeted towards Asian Americans, but I think it is something that we have to continue to bring up, because I think there has been some attempt to trivialize and minimize the experiences of Asian Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Russell, were you able to hear the question before you got bumped off?
No, sorry, can you repeat the question?
It was basically, I was asking you and Cynthia to speak, since so many students have joined us today, about your own political journeys, and to speak about how it is that you came to the work that you're doing right now, the community-based political work that you're doing right now.
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, my family arrived in the 19th century. And so everything that Asian Americans have gone through in Asian American history, my family's gone through too. So my family's been excluded. My family's been deported. My family's been maintained on Angel Island. My family's been segregated and quarantined because of tuberculosis. My parents grew up in Chinatowns. And so I have tuberculosis myself when I was a kid, because I hung out in Chinatown. And so again, health policy and racism are just sort of part of my family history. But then I benefited as an Asian American from the civil rights movement and from affirmative action. I went to grad school on a graduate fellowship for underrepresented groups, and Asian Americans were underrepresented. So I feel like my family has experienced the racism throughout history that Asians have had to go through, but I've also benefited from some of the privileges Asians now have of not being profiled in certain ways. And so I feel like it's my responsibility, understanding the past and recognizing how much privilege I've been given, having been able to go to college, having have more opportunities to speak out, to continue to identify with the Asian American community, especially those who are marginalized, especially those who are struggling, and to work for the improvement for all our communities. And so actually we were asked, Cynthia and I were asked this, what inspires you, what keeps you going during these dark times? And I I just wrote a book about Chinese Americans, and they always talk about their families and how everybody recognizes the legacy and the strength of their ancestors, and I want to acknowledge that. But they also look forward to the future for their own kids. And I have a kid. My daughter went to UC Santa Cruz and was a banana slug, and so I'm really saddened that my kids are growing up in a time where endangering the earth with global warming, that we're allowing African Americans to be killed by the government, that we're detaining kids at the border. And so I just feel like this is not the world that I want my kid to grow up in. And I don't want my grandkids to live in any of this type of the United States. And so that's what inspires me, and that's what keeps me going.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both so much. I have a number of questions that were asked in the chat. And so let me go through them, and I'm not going to identify the people who posed the questions since they posed them to me privately. One question is, you know, in this moment in which so many communities of color are being so heavily impacted, it can be easy to engage in oppression Olympics rather than coming together in solidarity. Do you have any insight, wisdom, comments to offer with regard to this? And I know you touched upon this briefly in your last slides.
Yeah, Russell, do you want me to go
Yeah,
first?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
We'll take turns. Yeah, I think that I think it is important to first recognize that what's been very heartening is that in this time, there's been lots of discussion about how this pandemic has exposed structural inequality. The fact that we have African Americans, Native Americans dying at a higher rate. In San Francisco, Asians make up 50% of deaths here. The fact that people are one paycheck away from being houseless and are experiencing food security. You know, these are the kinds of things that we should be talking about. And I think the fact that that this is a moment where we see racism rearing its ugly head in times of crisis is when we have to understand that it's systemic. And so I'm heartened by the fact that these conversations are happening. I mean, just think for a minute the paradigm shifts that we're making. We used to call workers low wage, low skilled workers. Now we're calling them essential workers. We're talking about the fact that there should be universal health care for all, that we shouldn't have health care tied to our jobs, because what happens when people lose their jobs? So I think that this is a moment where we have to look at racism, we have to look at income inequality, we have to look at capitalism, and all the ways that are set up to really divide and pit us against each other. And so, if anything, I feel like the conversations that we're having to build solidarity, meaningful solidarity, going beyond hashtags, but starting with ourselves in terms of understanding our history, understanding ways in which, especially, I think we have a history of working in solidarity, whether it was Filipino farm workers working with Latinx farm workers, some of the earlier stories of African Americans standing with Asians that were being targeted of violence. This is part of our story as well, in addition to Asian Americans standing up and resisting. So I think that it's sort of something that we have to dispel, that somehow the only way that our communities are going to act is if there's self-interest involved. In fact, if we look at what's happening today, this is the largest, most significant act of social solidarity that we've ever seen in our lifetime. I mean, imagine everybody doing their part to slow the spread of this virus, all the mutual aid, volunteering, all the ways in which people are recognizing how privileged we are to have food and shelter, to have jobs, who are stepping out and supporting those vulnerable and those most in need. And I think that that's what we want to build on when we think about what we need to do over the long term in terms of addressing anti-Asian hate and all the other forms of discrimination. I am very, very moved by my colleagues that are working to free people who are in detention and prisons who are dying at such high rates. These are breeding grounds they're like death chambers now. And so we have people speaking out, organizing with the Free Them All campaign. And these are the kinds of things that I think we need to be focused on.
Cynthia, thank you. I'm going to read another question that hits close to home for many of us. In April, UCSC graduate student Allison Skidmore made a post on Facebook calling Chinese people archaic and wishing that the pandemic had, quote, wiped the whole country off the planet, end quote. The university and Skidmore's lawyer claim that this is protected free speech, while discussion of the incident is being actively suppressed. What could the university be doing to address racist acts and expressions from its students?
You know, this issue of academic freedom and freedom of speech versus being sensitive to racist language that harms and hurts and exploits people is a real delicate balance that we're dealing with at San Francisco State. That's sort of a national issue. It's an issue that how do we come together as a nation and be able to talk about difficult political situations, like being able to criticize the Chinese government without bashing the Chinese people, right? Or in the Santa Cruz case, can a person call for genocide and say that's academic freedom? That's actually an intellectual sort of search or statement of her own part. I think, well, I'm starting the Center of Ethnic Studies because ethnic studies is part of the solution. It teaches us to understand the racial backgrounds and heritages of groups. It helps us understand the systematic structural racism. It helps us understand white supremacy that gives some people platforms to say things and other people keeps other people silence. So I agree we need to maintain our academic freedoms, but I think for me, this is my Asian American Asian side, that this assertion for our individual rights needs to be tempered with a concern for the collective good and what's collectively responsible. So I've got this notion of social justice that's sort of different from most Western people. A lot of people say human rights and even social justice is the assertion and defense of your individual rights, to say whatever you want, to go out without a mask. But from my Asian side, I say, no, justice is when we take corporate responsibility for each other. That the highest value isn't having your own rights. The highest value is being responsible and responsible for, right? And that's a very Asian, even way of thinking. So injustice occurs when we don't wear a mask because we're not thinking about others. Injustice occurs when we say whatever we want, even when it hurts other people. And so what I would like, as we could learn from ethnic studies, is that we hybridize Western notions of human rights, give people their freedoms, but also learn to become corporately responsible for each other, to develop that empathy that we need. You know, one last sort of preachy comment about solidarity. You know how a cough around the world impacts us on the other side of the world? That shows how interconnected we are, right? And so understanding how interconnected we are, how much we need solidarity, I think we just need to learn how to enact and live out that solidarity, that interconnectedness, rather than focusing so much on asserting our own rights.
Russell, do you have any thoughts about the question about the administration? And so, you know, the UC administration and the UC on the whole as well as US universities in general, have been very eager to accept international students from Asia. And yet, in a moment like this one, there, the 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 chat, basically the message is that the administration, what should the administration be doing in a situation like this? Like, what are some sort of ways, even in this moment that is hampered by the fact that we can't converge in the usual ways? Do you have any recommendations with regard to that? And Cynthia, did you want to chime in as well? Okay.
Yeah. I absolutely think that, well, first of all, this is an age-old problem of balancing, free speech and this whole notion of, oh, university should be the bastion of, a marketplace of ideas. And this notion, on the other hand, of creating a safe and welcoming learning environment. So I think that absolutely, I do feel as the administration, just like words matter, silence is deafening, right? To not come out and condemn language or rhetoric that is harmful to your student population, to your faculty, I think is irresponsible. We have seen other university leadership on other campuses come out with statements to the effect that really, again, denounces that kind of rhetoric, or any kind of rhetoric that will incite animus towards any group. And so I think that would be a really important first step. And I think it does concern me that there is suppression of any response to statements that have been made on Facebook. I mean, if in fact free speech is being held up and academic freedom is being held up, then why not debate it? Why not have the entire university community engage in that discussion? I think what happens is when, just like we're seeing in our incident reports, what happens is when people feel like they have the license to say whatever they want, to speak hurtful words, and we're silent about it, or we're not able to speak out about it, it has this effect of emboldening them, and in fact giving them the sense that they're speaking on behalf of so many other people. Well, what would be really helpful is to see that ratioed. For every one like, there are like 1,000 people saying you're dead wrong on this issue and it's hurting our community and I disagree with you. So I think that clearly I have very strong opinions about this that has grown over time, and where I have, really gone, to battle with my ACLU colleagues, who I have been in solidarity with and on the same page with on so many other issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. Russell, why don't we go to the next, another question? Some people wanted to hear more about what you described as the Second Chinese Exclusion Act. What are the likelihoods of this getting passed? What kind of support is there for that? What are the broad-based implications of this? There was also, how there was a New York Times report on how California is getting budgetarily hit, and something like international students at California universities bring in several $billion per year. And so just curious about who's supporting this Second Chinese Exclusion Act. It's specifically targeting students. Can you say more? Yeah, what do you foresee happening?
Yeah.
Well, this proposed legislation comes from Tom Cotton, who is a conspiracy theorist, who says that, again, the coronavirus was bred in the Wuhan lab, but he's also invoking national security, saying that Chinese scientists are threatening to take away our secrets and bring it back to China, and that's why we should ban STEM students. We could bring in Shakespeare scholars from China to learn about Western ways of being, but we shouldn't share with them or enable them to learn our technology or our science. That's the rationale. So again, just like the mass immigration ban, they're using the coronavirus and invoking national security, that Asians are a threat, both in terms of public health and a threat in terms of our economic national security, to try to exclude us. Again, it's a small fringe group, but just the fact that you have elected leaders with national platforms proposing this, stating this, I don't think it's likely to pass, but I think it's really would actually make a powerful statement if the Asian American community really strongly came out against it, right? To counter it, to say, we will not stand for such racist, inappropriate, and sort of useless actions. So actually, if anything, this is what Ted Lieu says, if anything, during this time of a global pandemic, why build walls with China when we need masks from China, when we need protective equipment from China, when we need health expertise from China? Really illogical. And this sort of China bashing has life or death consequences in two ways. My wife's a doctor, and if she doesn't have the protective gear, just the mask that we need, she could die, right? Because she's exposed. Asian Americans as a whole are at risk. Someone could have a rock thrown at them or, get pushed and they could die. So again, this sort of scapegoating of China leads to anti-Asian hate. So it's life or death consequences, this proposed legislation. And again, it hurts Chinese scholars and the international community overall. So yeah, it's easy to shoot down the idea, but I think it's a fringe proposal. But Stop API Hate has come out immediately against it. The Organization of Chinese Americans has an online petition now against it, and to be vigilant. We expect this type of policy to be in. After 9/11, Syrians, Muslims, Arabs were detained, deported, and had to register. Already, we have a mass immigration ban. We have the proposed Second Chinese Exclusion Act. Already, we know Chinese American scientists are being racially profiled, right? And so, Cynthia and I, we talk about, what if there's a mass shooting? That's not unlikely. That happened after 9/11 at a Sikh temple. And so our community has to be organized. We have to be ready. And that's why we're asking students to really report any incidents of hate, right? So that we could document what's going on and we could, show it to the government. You have to be accountable. It's on your hands. And we have to show it to corporations. A lot of this is happening in corporate sites. So such policies are being proposed. We expect more negative policies to be suggested, and that's why Stop API Hate and a lot of organizations, national organizations, are sort of preparing for these types of scenarios.
Can I ask you, so in terms of the data that you have been collecting, in what ways do you plan to use this? On the one hand, you stated so powerfully that this gives a kind of collective voice to the experience of people who are, who have been targeted by anti-Asian xenophobia. I wonder how else you intend to use this legislatively. I've seen Stop AAPI, the statistics reported in so many different media accounts. But can you speak about what your strategies are? How do you plan to animate those numbers?
Yeah. Well, I can start and Russell can certainly chime in. I mean, right now we are already in the phase and have been thinking about, so what are the appropriate responses? Again, a majority of these don't rise to hate crimes. So obviously for those that do, we want enforcement, we want civil rights protections, we want people to know their rights. We want people to have safety tips and what to do if you're a bystander, mental health resources. One of the things that we want to do now is take a deeper dive on these incidents. So Russell came up with this idea of like, well, let's look at the connection between rhetoric and incidents. So looking at the way, how many times was Trump invoked or anti-China sentiment expressed? I was particularly interested in, because women were likely to experience hate at twice the rate than men, over twice the rate. There is this terrible situation where it's both racist and misogynist. You know, there is sexist, racist statements that are being made. So there's something that we need to look at there. Yes, it is true women experience more street harassment than men, but let's look at what's happening around that. So we were also very interested in looking at the youth incidents and those that are affecting other parts of our elderly community. And then we obviously are looking at the private businesses where these incidents are taking place right now while we're sheltering in place, as well as you know, what can be done with regard to civil rights enforcement. So all of these data points help us to figure out what would be the best way to both change the hearts and minds, but also require enforcement of existing laws. But we all know that without attitudinal change, without people caring about this issue, without treating this issue seriously, these enforcements of laws, you know, will have very little effect if we're not doing all these things at the same time. So that's kind of what we're working towards at this stage.
Yeah, so like Cynthia said, it's both education to change the the minds, enforcement to scare the hearts, and maybe more education to develop the hearts. You know, we talked about the range of issues. It's mental health, it's youth harassment in schools, it's elderly abuse, it's gendered harassment, it's corporate sites of lack of access to goods and services, it's hate crime enforcement. So there's a range of issues that we're working on. And so that's why we're calling on the government to create a strike force, to have every agency proactively address it. The Department of Education has to investigate anti-bullying curriculum and ethnic studies. The Department of Fair Housing and Employment have to protect worker rights and be proactive about giving workers knowledge about what their rights are. The Attorney General has to enforce hate crimes. Department of Health has to provide mental health resources. So, you know, because this anti-Asian racism hits all areas of our life, that's why we're holding government and all its agencies to be accountable and to be proactive. Not only government, but again, corporations, because again, a lot of these incidents are occurring in corporations. So one thing corporations could do is, you know, just as much as they put up signage saying you have to keep physically distant 6 feet, they could have also put up signs saying, customers, please respect your fellow customers, or employees are not allowed to discriminate against any customer. So given the particular topic area, we're going to come up with specific policy interventions. This is what ethnic studies does. It's knowledge for the power of the community to bring about effective change. And so if anybody wants to do data analysis with us or do policy analysis, we welcome them.
Really? So how should they contact you?
Why don't they contact you and you'll funnel the links to me.
I'm glad to.
Yeah.
Contact me, and I'm totally serious. Contact me if you're interested in doing that, and I will work with you in whatever capacity I can so we can mutually strengthen each other's work. And I wanted to say something, you know, like both of you have spoken so powerfully about the public value of ethnic studies. And, you know, in this moment in which, as you've both spoken about, structural racism is exposed, it's also the case that structural racism still operates in certain ways in moments of crises. So structural racism in moments of crises doesn't just reconsolidate the status quo in this moment. You know, it's no coincidence that in historic moments of crises, when there has been a language of austerity that comes forward, ethnic studies, women and gender studies programs, feminist studies, etc., all these programs get hit. And so diversity sort of follows logic. Not everyone has the history of having a 50-year-old ethnic studies program. You know, at Santa Cruz, we're 6 years old. And so
Mm.
we're kind of on the last hired, first fired, that we occupy a precarious position. And I just wonder if you could speak about what the significance is, for Santa Cruz. You've come here, you've spoken about this. What is the importance of ethnic studies um, in moments like this going forward? What is the value of it?
I'll let Cynthia start as a product of ethnic studies.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's essential. There's always been a debate about whether it should be a standalone or just integrated, as part of like American history. We are part of the history. And I think that it's been critical in terms of developing my own analysis and even questioning why things are the way they are. They're not by accident, as I've mentioned before. And it gave me the opportunity to be exposed to other communities of color and their experiences. My ability to look at these issues with a gender lens as well has been formidable. And I apply it to everything that we do here at CAA and also at Stop API Hate, because of the fact that I know that we have the ability and the power to create change. We've never had elected officials take the lead. It's always been because we were organized and demanded change and equality. We have to remember that. And it's on the campuses. That's where the energy and the leadership has come from. And so I feel like ethnic studies programs not only should be preserved, but they should be expanded and invested in. And that's got to be, I think, the future, especially for places like California, where we do we will make up the majority as a whole. And so I think that this is fundamental to our policies, cultural change work, and the ways that our community can rise up against this time.
Yeah.
And
Russell,
we wouldn't have started without like Russell saying, hey, look at this stuff, look at this data we're seeing, look at the media accounts.
mm-hmm.
And so that dedicated discipline has been critical in our efforts, because we're a society that's so obsessed with data, but it's up to us to interpret it and to make recommendations on what we think can be done from the community's perspective.
Yeah, like you said, Christine, institutions just sort of perpetuate, or Cynthia maybe said that, the system's working the way it's supposed to work, to perpetuate the status quo and to perpetuate the inequalities that we see today. And ethnic studies is a counter institution to challenge all that. I want to remain rooted in the initial struggles from which ethnic studies was founded. It came out of a grassroots student strike, right? Where the students were connected to their local communities, where they didn't want ethnic studies for students, they wanted ethnic studies for their communities to better learn how they could affect change in their communities. And that's what I hope for ethnic studies at Santa Cruz, that it's not just for individual students to learn their history or to develop an identity, but it's to learn how to affect change to make our communities better. And we have these values of activism, of social justice, of self-determination that I think we still embody and we're still trying to pull today. And so as Santa Cruz develops its program, and you already have great faculty there, and I know that a lot of the students already come from California communities and have local roots. I think just like this spate of anti-Asian racism, that's sort of what we're designed to do. That's what our programs are meant to do, is to know what are the issues facing our community and to either give voice and creative expression for the communities, to understand the history so that we know how to resist the racism, or to develop social sciences so that we could actually not understand the trends, but actually figure out what are the creative solutions to help ameliorate them. And so ethnic studies is pretty fun. It's promising, and it's rooted in values that I really want to adhere to. And so that's why I appreciate people like Cynthia who live out of their values, not necessarily out of career aspirations or I don't know what else you could be living for.
I have no career aspiration. Just so you know, my parents were always like, what is ethnic studies? What kind of a job are you going to get?
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. I don't think that my parents even know what I do, but
Right.
okay. Yeah. Yeah, no, I really appreciate your saying that and closing on that note, because it's, programs, educational programs that are marked as fulfilling a diversity function also could paradoxically be a casualty of this moment.
Yeah.
And, even though these kinds of discussions are only possible because of the fact that the work that we do has been informed by ethnic studies, all three of us, in conversation here together. There were many people who in the chat wanted to say thank you. And I join with them in thanking you so much for the work that you're doing and for all of the insight that you have brought to us. I will work with the students here and we will work with you so gladly. So in any way that we can be of help to this project and take part in it, we would welcome a chance to do so. And so thank you everyone for joining us late in the quarter on a Friday afternoon. And thank you so much to everyone, Meredith, Kaz, Jorge, Lisa Supple, other people who participated in making sure that this event could happen. And above all, Russell and Cynthia, thank you so very much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Christine. So just a quick closing in addition to Christine, thank you both to Russell and Cynthia. I will send out a link next week with the recording for those of you who want to share it with your colleagues. And then I'll also send out an email to all the participants just to let them know the recording if they weren't able to make it live due to unforeseen conflicts. So thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.